Are we really heading for a global conflict? Is there a new Cold War? And if so, who is winning? And if it's not us, where are we going wrong? This is the story of the Brics versus Build Back Better and the emerging global conflict that began with the Russo-Ukraine war. The unthinkable has happened, a conventional war on the continent of Europe, but the military has been slow to adapt. Yes, Europe has seen bloodshed since 1945, terrorism, militias fighting in balkanized countries, unmatched air power imposing diplomacy on those accused of breaching the peace. The invasion of Ukraine has exposed shortcomings that the government must quickly address. This can be done by reassessing World War II and our part in it. With war now firmly on the agenda, different versions of authoritarianism are set against each other, driving the rival camps from crisis to conflict. Brics versus Build Back Better is the new divide, and the spark is the wrestling over Ukraine. The divisions predate the clash of arms in Ukraine, which is a casus belli for a wider dispute surrounding international relations, and who interprets the laws of the so-called rules-based international order. The Brics, an alternative geopolitical alliance to the G7 and post-World War II global architecture, is developing its own parallel institutions. They are working on a currency that is not dependent upon the US dollar. This growing bloc has its own education initiatives and even holds its own games. The Brics have been involved in nation building, creating national unity and celebrating their identity. Much of this expresses itself in opposition to governments in the so-called West. Despite some Brics states being authoritarian, aggressive military powers, they use anti-imperialist rhetoric to further their agenda. A multipolar world has been born. The invasion of Ukraine is its midwife. One side has the resources and a growing population, the other has debt, the dollar, and dependent migrants. What is more, the Western World Economic Forum, Davos, Build Back Better states have been dividing and denigrating their own countries and filling them with foreigners whose support cannot be relied upon should conscription be required. Other alliances are also being weaponized. The US-led NATO expansion into Ukraine, with their personnel now directly attacking targets in Russia, especially its nuclear attack warning system, something which should have no bearing on the war in Ukraine, has led Russia to rally Belarus, over which Russia exercises suzerainty, and the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, to its cause. The CSTO is a Russian-led balance of power or counterweight military alliance in Eurasia consisting of Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia and Tajikistan. Recruits from that organization and Central Asia, even Afghanistan, will swell the ranks of the Russian army. The principles which gave Britain and her allies victory in the last great conflagration have largely been forgotten. With freedom threatened at home as well as from abroad, we need to look back to learn how to move Britain forward. Many thought the future of warfare was meeting the challenge posed by small wars, tackling irregular insurgents overseas in faraway lands, fighting underdeveloped peoples who can be eliminated by air power and mopped up by nimble mobile units, lightly armed and agile, crossing terrain in armored vehicles that can shield their crew from small arms fire, but little else. NATO accordingly developed training and tactics that is, when willing allows, capable of defeating guerrilla forces. It is this training that has been imparted to Ukrainian troops since 2014 when fighting began in that country. In the initial stage of the 2022 Russian invasion, these skills worked well against Russian battle groups, which were a failed experiment using independent mobile combined arms units. The Ukrainians could strip away the supporting infantry, leaving the armor and artillery vulnerable to encirclement. The battle groups were divided and operated without sufficient air and mutually supporting artillery cover. The conflict in Eastern Europe has entered a new stage that has a semblance to the Second World War and even the Great War before that. The training and tactics taught by NATO are of little use in such a struggle of artillery, air power, and entrenched men. Western-trained Ukrainian soldiers have performed poorly against the Russian military and their heavily mined defenses. Conversely, those that have served in the fight in Donbass since 2014 have been more able. In some instances, NATO-devised tactics have had to be abandoned, just as the burned-out shells of American Bradley armored personnel carriers also had to be abandoned. Complacency and inefficiency have all had their part to play, but, as told in the book World War II, The First Culture War, an American-centric view of the world and a misunderstanding of its role in defeating Nazi Germany have also played a part in leading military planners down dead ends. A romanticized Hollywood version of history was allowed to prevail that depicts swift-moving mobile American units charging forward, finding weak spots and exploiting any success. In this trial-and-error approach to warfare, the starting point of where the main breakthrough would be achieved and the attack's final destination were unknown. In the Second World War, such tactics were replicated across American lines. The American Supreme Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, delayed victory with his broad front strategy, but the Allies triumphed all the same, and commanders such as General George S. Patton have since been fetishized. The problems, however, were forgotten, as was Britain's vital role. American triumphs were achieved because the British Army fixed the enemy and wore them down in gritty attritional fighting. Men like Field Marshal Montgomery developed precise plans which focused his forces' strength, utilized combined arms, and employed artillery and air power to annihilate resistance. Monty, as he was known to his men, created colossal cracks in German lines by letting artillery do the heavy lifting. This preserved the lives of the soldiers under his command. It also allowed the Americans to sweep in, take ground, and the glory. American leaders aiming to assume the leadership of the post-war world attempted to take all the glory for the downfall of Hitler. Consequently, they wrote out or even denigrated the role of Britain and its generals. The problem is that the vital part of the equation played by Britain has been ignored until now. The American military, by far the biggest component of NATO, has passed on its approach to all signatories. From there, a cavalier attitude to war and a romanticized attachment to attacking to excess without adequate numbers was adopted by Ukraine in their failed 2023 counteroffensive. They were fighting on too many fronts. What is more, during its counterattacks, Ukraine actually lost more territory than it gained. Since the failures of the counteroffensive, the exhausted Ukrainian armed forces have been forced onto the defensive in a desperate battle for real estate. This equates to Ukraine trading the lives of its people in exchange for preserving territory. For a large country with a low population, this is an unnecessary and ruinous policy that does not offer the opportunity to sever overstretched Russian supply lines. Fighting pointless battles for depopulated ruins of towns that have become moonscapes like Artemovsk, also known as Bakhmut, deprived Ukraine of the men it needed for offensives. Those soldiers are now either in the grave or, after being subjected to 2 years of near-constant fighting without troop rotations, exhausted and psychologically broken, especially as in some instances money that should have been spent on fixed defenses instead disappeared into the corrupt ether. Ultimately, Ukraine is losing both territory and people. As Frederick the Great stated, "He who defends everything defends nothing." For a country where some lionize Germany, Ukrainian decision-makers should really know better. It appears the intention is to prove their willingness to fight and die if needs be, in the hope of securing more European and US aid, and perhaps benefit from even more direct NATO involvement. Since the start of the 2023 spring and summer counteroffensive, Ukrainian servicemen were encouraged to probe for weaknesses and attempt to effect a breakthrough. This did not happen, even though American military aid to Ukraine is greater than Russia's entire pre-war defense budget. Ukrainian forces barely reached, let alone breached, Russian defense lines. Recriminations were underway whilst the offensive was still ongoing. The war is not just between Russia and America's proxy Ukraine. European states are also heavily involved, Germany chief amongst them. Elements of the German press were openly critical of Ukrainian commanders. One hopes the Germans do not think they can do better. Certainly they are concerned their Leopard tanks, once thought to be the world's premier panzer, has performed poorly, with many knocked out by Russian missiles. The UK cannot be smug. Britain's Challenger 2 tank was also deemed unsuitable for the fight against Russia in Ukraine. The failure to fight the right war has been matched by the inability to prepare for any other conventional wars. Supplies to Ukraine have depleted stores of ammunition to such an extent that the security of Western nations has been compromised, and still Ukraine cannot match Russian artillery fire. This is not the only shortcoming. US-supplied drones have not been as effective as hoped, and we were thinking that Amazon would soon be delivering our parcels by air. The fighting has been centered on the European Union's eastern frontier, which remains an economic backwater even though Ukraine is resource-rich. It is now dependent on money from its Western patrons, a problem for all concerned given that its politics, armed forces and society suffer from corruption which is just worsened by its allies throwing money at the problem. Furthermore, Ukraine faces a dire demographic decline regardless of the outcome of the war. A military victory may not even be its friend. It would open the door to EU membership and continued open borders to the West, allowing for more emigration, further reducing its population, just as severely as Russian rockets and artillery are doing so. The depopulated farmland will be sold to foreign investors, and its now liberal, enlightened leaders will diversify the country and import the young men from abroad that are so sadly missing. The birth rate crashed when Ukraine left the USSR and continues plummeting down. A woke Holodomor is already underway. Aping Western Europe is the aim for some pride parades are now imposed on Russian-speaking Kharkov. Ukraine is where cultures clash. Previously, it was Central European Roman Catholicism butting up against Eastern Orthodox civilization. Now it is woke Westerners against traditional Eastern family values, yet they are just attempts at moral justifications for a war. The fight over Ukraine's fertile soils and the hydrocarbons below then is the real motivation. If a Ukrainian victory requires any degree of compromise, radical elements are unlikely to accept the will of the peace party. A settlement could provoke a scenario similar to that experienced in Ireland after it achieved independence from Britain. The resulting civil war was far more deadly and vicious than the early struggle against the perceived occupying power. Political problems are already emerging. The decree by which Zelensky rules by decree has itself expired. "We are here to preserve democracy, not to practice it," so said the submarine captain played by Gene Hackman in Crimson Tide. A 2019 Rand Corporation paper advocated overstretching Russia to precipitate a Soviet-style collapse. This has not happened. Indeed, the reverse is true. Nation-building efforts, higher hydrocarbon prices, and a ready market for its wares amongst the anti-US Brics nations have transformed Russia's economy, which was once smaller than that of Italy, turbocharging Russian growth so that it overtakes Germany, which has been hit by a slump, high inflation, particularly excessive energy costs, and a house price collapse. Germany, a major contributor to the Kiev authorities, has received little for their support. They are facing deindustrialization, which is partly driven by high energy costs, caused by the need to pivot from Russian gas to that sourced from America. A situation that is unlikely to change after the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. Whilst some may choose to play the world's smallest violin for Germany, we've all been hit by increased costs and the higher price of fuel. Yet this is not something countries in Asia are suffering from. Russia has found a ready market to sell its oil at below market rates, but still at a higher rate than the price charged before the war began. This gives a competitive advantage to our Asiatic rivals and encourages the exporting of jobs from nations such as the UK to states like India. Even before US-led sanctions rebounded and handed the Russians an advantage, their economy should not have been big enough to support its military. However, it was, and they achieved efficiencies that economists in the West can only dream of. Russia has more nuclear weapons than the United States. The Russians and the Chinese have hypersonic missiles to which we may have no defense. These devices threaten and perhaps make redundant even the aircraft carrier, which may now be considered too big to fail. Any unwillingness to use these ships in combat would make these leviathans obsolete. These shortcomings should not have been allowed to happen, especially as NATO defense spending dwarfs its Russian rival. The taxpayer should be outraged. The waste at the heart of the Ministry of Defense is astounding. Like many civil service departments, rent-seeking corporations profit by being awarded government contracts to do little, badly. This disease is even affecting those that we rely on for our security. The Ministry of Defence spends with little accountability. Never in the field of human government was so much taken from so many and given to so few. Its procurement failures are characterized by overruns in both time and budgets. The taxpayer pays and private interests benefit. Britain's military spending was comparable to that of Russia, yet our armed forces are continually being cut in size. What is more, our aircraft carriers lacked missile protection and even steam catapults which can neatly help launch planes. There was also a deficit of support ships. Oh, and they do not have the modern planes to stock their hangars and fly from their decks. More wasted money. There is a deep reluctance in the state to incur the expense of large armies. It's war fighting on a budget. What funds are available go towards those who have won, not battles, but government contracts. The Ministry of Defence has become just like every other inefficient public service. Despite record spending, or perhaps because of it, there are more bureaucrats than belligerents. The same disease which affects the NHS, leading to excessive waiting lists, also infects policing, which has at least become efficient at giving out crime numbers. Like Britain's other creaking public services, the Ministry of Defence should undoubtedly receive more, yet calls for more spending on the military should be accompanied by demands to know where the money will be spent and how. Russia is doing this for their armed forces. The recent appointment of economist Andrei Belousov as Minister for Defence is seen as a drive to get value for money, achieve efficiency and drive out corruption. Some analysts see this as necessary when handling bigger budgets, especially in an institutionally corrupt country. His appointment is seen as getting the country match fit for a conflict with NATO. And the response in the so-called West? Doubling down on diversity initiatives, and even Donald Trump's attempts to secure more funding from frontline European countries have been met with derision rather than a recognition of the crisis we are in. Like any go woke, go broke corporate institution, resources are wasted on concern about carbon emissions. This and the many diversity initiatives are dangerous distractions. The recent woke Wigston report seeks to transform the armed forces socially and introduces the notion of extreme behaviours. Willingness to fight for king and country and expressing one's patriotism is now to invite suspicion. Ironically, the report's author, Air Chief Marshal Sir Michael Wigston, is a prominent proponent of the Russian threat. Yet his diversity initiatives threaten the military capabilities for which Britain was once famed. The military-industrial complex has been replaced by the military woke censorship alliance. Divisive identity politics lost the Nazis the Second World War. Their extreme prejudices misallocated resources and undermined meritocracy. In a naive way, our military has regretfully mirrored this by embracing the latest strand of identity politics. Priority is being given to pilots on the grounds of race, not ability or aptitude. Standards are being made less severe to facilitate women joining the ranks and not dissuade a less healthy population from signing up. Long gone are the ways of Field Marshal Montgomery, the Spartan general, who wrote the British Infantry Training Manual and who was second to none in imparting warfighting skills to his subordinates. He taught Britain's Tommies to fight World War II. It's not all bad for Ukraine. They have lasted longer than the French did in 1940. However, France is now sending instructors to the war-torn country. Leaked footage of French officers training Ukrainian servicemen in trench clearing, even without defenders and no return fire, saw the soldiers under French instruction fail to coordinate their actions. There would surely be a debacle should they attempt to storm an occupied position. The French have also sent mercenaries to Ukraine, which have died in Russian attacks. The ex-Rothschild French President Emmanuel Macron has now dispatched soldiers to Odessa on the Black Sea. This replicates an adventure in 1918 when a French military mission to Odessa quickly ended in failure, as the locals preferred the Russian Reds to the French-backed Whites. France, like Britain, now has a paucity of fighting men that can be committed to any overseas conflict. The French have recently been driven out of their pseudo-colonies in the Sahel. African anti-colonial forces that object to their currencies being pegged with the euro, a measure which has created a trade imbalance and economic stagnation, have installed new governments and turned to Russian military contractors to provide security. Not only are the French being chased out of sub-Saharan Africa, they are also being chased out of France. A low-scale civil war with its own disadvantaged Muslim population is developing. A spate of church burnings and growing tensions with the Islamic population are shattering the cohesiveness of the Fifth Republic. Its small army is hardly ready for war. Macron is no Martel. The training debacle has been worsened by Ukraine's manpower shortage and led them to reduce the training for often unwilling conscripts who are sent to the front unprepared for what they will face. This is not something which Field Marshal Montgomery would have allowed to happen. The French are not alone in providing inadequate training. Royal Marines have been providing training for operations to seize islands and a spit of land on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. These have not been successful, and this is despite the provision of superior patrol boats to those used by their adversaries. Such NATO-supplied equipment surpasses Russian vessels that they have salvaged or requisitioned. A video emerged of Russian personnel being shot and blown into the air after being sighted and unable to flee when they could not get their motor to start. This matter led to a scandal in Russia and a propaganda success for Kiev. However, supplying these patrol boats has made NATO take on the role of Karen, ferrying poor souls into the afterlife. When crossing the river, they are vulnerable to drone strikes, and even when ashore, such as in the Battle of Krinky, the Ukrainians have been subjected to withering artillery fire. The Ukrainian Marines thought they were speeding across the Dnieper, yet they were actually crossing the Styx. This is not the first time that the training of foreign allies failed to provide them with necessary skills. The recent expedition to Afghanistan's Helmand province involved placing the now defunct Afghan National Army under Britain's tutelage. No benchmarks were given, and instructing the local forces was not done in the professional manner that the British armed forces were once associated. That war, through an unwillingness to commit all the resources needed, has been lost. The war in Ukraine is still underway. Russia has learnt from its mistakes. The time taken from when an enemy is detected to them being placed under attack from drones and artillery has been reduced. Efforts are also taken to protect the lives of its servicemen. Advances are deliberately limited to field by field, village by village, baby steps, with soldiers moving through forests or using tree cover to seize locations from where fire control can be established over Ukrainian fortifications, which are then cut off, and its defenders then face the inglorious option of either surrendering or finding themselves annihilated. Where advances have to come over open terrain, armored vehicles backed up by heavily armored porcupine and turtle tanks, mounting electronic warfare equipment to stop Ukrainian drones, deliver soldiers to covered areas from where they begin their Montgomery-style crumbling operations in a war of attrition reminiscent of his victory in the Second Battle of El Alamein. In some instances, Russian personnel storm the line of contact using armored fistbores head tactics to break through, using surprise as well as shock to take a position, fortify it, and disrupt defenses that are then pressured into collapsing. Any personnel sneaking or storming behind enemy lines can even be resupplied by drones until the line is sufficiently perforated to allow for a much larger breakthrough to shatter what is left of their enemy and relieve the surrounded forlorn hope pioneers. Even highly mobile motorbikes are used to make a rapid breakthrough. Armored motorcycles are also being deployed with cages that protect against drone attacks. Increasingly, AI robotic vehicles are dispatched. This is a war that increasingly makes use of technological solutions that resemble the funnies deployed by Montgomery on D-Day and were developed by his brother-in-law Percy Hobart. Russian industry has been transformed from Soviet times of molten steel being molded and forged into place in oppressive plants. High-tech equipment is now being produced in clean, modern factories that are efficient, and its workers believe they have a stake in Russia's national project and perform to their utmost. This is something that Montgomery understood. He would visit factories in the Second World War to keep up the morale of those that toiled in such plants, ensuring that his men had the means to fight Germany. His training and inspiration helped improve their will. These are desperate times. The once freedom-loving nations are finding that potential enemies abroad now show greater inventiveness than Britain and the USA, which once led the world in innovation and research. In that field, America has now been surpassed by China. Professional notions have also found their way onto the battlefield, with financial incentives being offered to Russian soldiers to destroy showpiece NATO equipment, particularly tanks, which were meant to be state-of-the-art. Consequently, Russia has had no trouble recruiting for this war, and its armed forces are awash with men and material. Conversely, Ukraine has had to resort to draconian conscription, press-ganging men off the street if they dare to venture out of their homes. Popular Ukrainian Google searches include how to escape the country to avoid a war many of its citizens do not want to fight. These searches are often in Russian, the language spoken and understood by most in the Ukraine. Incidentally, the average age of Ukrainian soldiers serving at the front is mid-40s. When they should be planning their retirement, they are sent into battle. Other Build Back Better states also have a declining population. It is not just our public services where government procurement and investment fails to deliver value for money. This affects all NATO countries. The US is spending $42 billion on internet connectivity that has yet to get anyone online. Musk's Starlink service could have been procured for a fraction of the cost, but has been overlooked. The list goes on. The New York City Department of Parks and Recreation spent $4.7 million on a public bathroom in a park in the Bronx. A gold pan was not even provided. They're flushing money away. Transport infrastructure also illustrates the divide, especially the recurrence of crashes on the New York subway, which ranks below Moscow's metro. In the UK, there is the debacle of HS2 and the £100 billion price tag to get people out of post-industrial cities and arrive in London 20 minutes earlier than at present. It need not be so. China can construct superior transportation, and even Russia can build a 326-mile railway through eastern Ukraine, connecting the port city of Rostov-on-Don to Crimea. Don't they know there is a war on? Not only is that joined up, thinking it also makes redundant NATO-assisted Ukrainian attacks on the Crimean bridge connecting the Kerch and Taman peninsulas. The collective West should not get mad, but should get even before it's too late. In Europe and the USA, the growth of managerialism and corporatism has led to overmighty military contractors controlling the market and selling to out-thought and outmaneuvered procurement managers whose dream is to be on the other side of the table. They willingly buy on our behalf, using our money, excessively expensive systems that do not work or require yet more investment to become operational. We are being scammed. Russian military production of essentials like artillery shells outstrips the totality of that which is produced by NATO, South Korea and Japan, two countries that are also aiding Ukraine. Russia, however, is backed by Iran, North Korea and China. Russia also receives financial aid through the United Arab Emirates and its Dubai-based financial center. Ukraine's patrons are being outcompeted by Russian military production, and the heavily indebted EU and USA has no long-term plan to provide the endless resources that Ukraine needs. Hard graft is needed, but the collective West is relying on a Wunderwaffe approach, hoping that new weapons will turn the tide. However, these are either being jammed or do not introduce an element that Ukraine did not have when the war began and has since been destroyed by Russia, only to be reintroduced and destroyed again, such as tactical military aircraft. Other weapons gifted to Ukraine are made inoperable, like the HIMARS system, which in some instances has been disabled or rendered ineffective through jamming. The Russian military-industrial complex provides better value for money, partly because of purchasing power parity that favors Russia and the ruble, the currency that Western sanctions were meant to collapse, but instead benefited from global efforts to de-dollarize. The attempts to cut off those that question the USA's so-called rules-based international order from the financial system have merely encouraged the development of new architecture and an alternative system. American overreach and the politicization of the global reserve currency has rebounded on the US dollar and led to products like oil being traded and paid for in other currencies, most notably the yuan or indeed the ruble. This assured that currency's value. The petrodollar is no more, and the role of global hegemon is now a matter that China and the US will compete for. Ukraine does not have a plan for victory. Montgomery would have had one. Monty would also have recognized the fighting and the need to train, build and unleash an overwhelming force following a clear master plan. He would also see the need for a peace settlement. Indeed, the current fighting for both sides is now motivated by the desire to improve their negotiating positions before the next round of peace talks get underway. Nevertheless, the window for Ukrainian success has now passed. Perhaps Montgomery's Rule 1 of warfare should also be remembered: don't march on Moscow. Britain and its efficient industries in the Second World War produced more planes than the massive USSR. We won because industry had been honed by the requirements of a competitive market. The same cannot be said today. The balance of global power is shifting to the nationalistic Brics. Our security cannot be taken for granted. We need to improve the business of war and bring back the notion of professionalism and patriotism. In the next war, we may not be so lucky. Robert Olds is the author of World War II, The First Culture War.